Well, tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. My name is Murray Bruges. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation, Mahi Arongo. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's conversation between former Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Right Honourable Helen Clark, and former Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull. As always, a very warm welcome to our Helen Clark Foundation members. Our foundation is an evidence-based, independent and non-partisan think tank, and we could not do this work without your support. If you're not a member of the foundation, please consider supporting our work by becoming a member at Helen Clark, that's all one word, .foundation. You'd also be most welcome to register for our free newsletters while there. For those of you who haven't joined many of our webinars before, it's worth noting that this is a webinar, not a normal Zoom call. Your cameras and microphones are off, so there's no risk anyone can see or hear you eating your lunch. That said, we'd love for you to participate in this webinar, and the best way for you to do so is to submit questions as they occur to you by typing them into Zoom's Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. You'll also see there is a separate chat function. We might use that section to put links during the webinar. Please do submit your questions into the Q&A area. Today's webinar will explore a range of issues, including Australia's recent voice referendum, renewable energy, climate policy, and the Australia-New Zealand relationship. At around the 40-minute mark, we'll switch to a Q&A session, and at that point, Helen will put the questions you have entered into the Q&A section to our guest today. After the webinar has ended, you should receive a message to fill out a quick survey about today's webinar. If you have a moment, we'd greatly appreciate hearing from you, and we very much do take your feedback into account as we're planning future webinars. That's it for admin. I'll now introduce our guest today before handing over to Helen. The Honourable Malcolm Turnbull was Australia's 29th Prime Minister, serving between 2015 and 2018. Before entering politics, Mr. Turnbull had international careers in law, business and the media. As Prime Minister, he reformed Australia's personal income tax, education and childcare systems, oversaw the legalisation of same-sex marriage, and announced the construction of Snowy Hydro 2.0, the biggest pumped hydro scheme in the Southern Hemisphere. Mr. Turnbull also embarked on the largest peacetime investment in Australian defence capabilities and set out Australia's first national cybersecurity strategy. Globally, Mr. Turnbull played a leading role in reviving the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now called the CPTPP, after the United States withdrew. Both before and after his political career, Mr. Turnbull has been a successful venture capitalist, co-founding Oz Email Limited, the first Australian tech company to be listed on the NASDAQ. Since leaving politics, he has resumed his business career with interests in technology, hydropower, and green hydrogen, as well as hosting an excellent podcast series on defending democracy. We're very pleased to have you join us live from Sydney today, Mr. Turnbull, and over to you, Helen.
Well, thank you, Murray. Thank you, Malcolm, for being with us. In fact, a real personal pleasure to have Malcolm on our webinar series. We go back close to 3 decades when I was leader of the opposition, and I visited Malcolm on an official mission to Australia when he was the leader of the Australian Republican movement, still a cause being aspired to, obviously, by many in Australia, if not here. So Malcolm, as you heard from Murray's introduction last night, is involved in many things post-politics, as many of us tend to be, and a lot of them are of huge interest to us, Malcolm. So we're going to tap into your current perspectives and experiences, because we like to bring great international views to a New Zealand audience. And I thought, just to get the ball rolling, we'd start with how you're seeing the global trends that you're following at the moment, and what do you think is most likely of these to be impacting on our part of the world for next year? What have we got to look forward to, or what are the challenges we're going to have to be tackling or continuing to tackle as we end this rather tumultuous year and go into 2024? Over to you, Malcolm.
Wow, Helen, look, thank you so much, and thanks, Murray, for the very kind introduction. It's great to see you again. Of course, we've seen each other over the years since we first met in my office in Sydney in the early 90s, but it's good. It's lovely to be talking with you. Okay, well, big trends. I mean, there are so many. I guess the big overarching existential threat is global warming. In a sense, it doesn't matter what people say. or believe or think about global warming. It's an inexorable consequence of physics. And unless we stop burning fossil fuels, we are going to make this planet of ours increasingly uninhabitable for billions of people. So that cracking on with that job is just all pervasive, and the obligation is fundamental and basic if we want to care for the only planet we've got. Within our own societies, liberal democracies, we've got to recognise the risk of populist authoritarianism. You've only got to look at what's happened in a number of European countries, let alone what's happened and is happening in the United States. We cannot take our democracies for granted. We can't be complacent about it. Around the world, real threats, real conflicts. I mean, the terrible, tragic conflict in the Middle East, an equally terrible conflict in Ukraine with Russia's illegal and cruel, barbaric invasion of Ukraine. There are risks abound, and of course, in our own region, there is always that looming risk of a conflict with China, particularly if Xi Jinping decides that he wants to, forcibly incorporate Taiwan into the People's Republic of China, and whether that could lead to a nuclear war. You don't know. It is very hard to predict what has often been called the ladder of escalation works, and even that term suggests it's an orderly process. Both world wars started from relatively small events, and could have been thwarted, if you like, or blocked. So yeah, there's risks abound, but there's plenty of reason to be positive too. The pace of technology continues, and I think if we can, avoid frying the planet or killing each other, we've got every reason to be optimistic. But human nature being what it is, there's reasons to doubt on both scores.
Yeah, risks everywhere, as you say, minefields literally everywhere. And Australia, like New Zealand, has been a pretty full supporter of Ukraine's pushback against the aggression of its neighbour. But one of the prospects often, sort of in the ether there is there's a nuclear power which has attacked Ukraine, and that doomsday clock that hovers close to midnight remains a worry, does it not?
It sure does, yeah, absolutely.
So plenty there in the global scene of concern. Now, just perhaps, picking up the first of the points you made about the climate change issues, the climate crisis issues. I know you've just been at the Conference of Parties for the Climate Change Convention in Dubai, which has had a lot of media, right? It hasn't gone without notice that the president of the COP is the head of the National Oil Company for Abu Dhabi, and there's been a lot of debate about his level of commitment to a COP where fossil fuels are targeted. It's become a bit of an industry show as well, I understand, and you have some reflections on that. But what was the vibe when you were there? What were you picking up in Dubai about where this COP is going?
Well, I was there for the first week, and I was there in my capacity as president of the International Hydropower Association, and also chairman of the Green Hydrogen Organisation. So the IHA is, a long-standing industry group representing hydropower pretty much in every jurisdiction around the world. And the Green Hydrogen Organisation was something that Andrew Forrest and I set up a few years ago as a group, a global advocacy group, to basically make the case that says, you know, the only hydrogen we should be using in the new clean economy is that which is made by electrolyzing water with renewable electricity. You know, there's the fossil fuel lobby are keen to keep making hydrogen in the same way, which is was using methane, which is CH4, what they call steam reformation of methane, which is a process that's, you know, been around for a long time, but it results in massive emissions of CO2. And what the fossil fuel lobby have been arguing is to say, oh, well, don't worry, we'll capture the CO2 and sequester it. Now, you and I have both been around in energy politics for long enough to know that carbon capture and storage was a great idea that billions have been spent on, but frankly has rarely, if ever, worked. And so, you know, we call out, you know, BS to that and say, let's just focus on making hydrogen in a way that we know is not going to add to our greenhouse gas problems. Anyway, so that's why I was there. Look, I think the mood was cautiously optimistic. It was, there isn't the same sort of expectation of a big breakthrough as there was in Paris in 2015, which I attended as PM, or Glasgow the year before last. And you're right, it has become a big trade show. I mean, is that a bad thing? I don't know. I think one of the good things is just the scale of the renewable transition. You know, the solar energy, solar generation, for example, just to pick one, is growing globally at a compound rate of in excess of 20% per annum. Now, you know, that is just, I don't think there's ever been a technology that has spread as quickly as that. And you know, wind is not quite as fast. But the renewable transition is happening. It's happening faster in China than anywhere else, but you know, there's reasons for that. But I think the fundamental question, and this is a point Andrew Forrest has been making there, is, are you going to commit to phasing out fossil fuels? I mean, ultimately, you know, we're in a sort of, you know, I mean, we're a bit like the alcoholic, you know, who is confronted with the reality that he has to stop drinking alcohol. You know, ultimately, he's got to the point, you know, where some people do, where that's the only alternative. Now, we're at that point where we've just got to give it up. We've got to stop burning fossil fuels. There's a bunch of other things we've got to do too. But the one thing we've got to do is stop burning fossil fuels. And the interesting thing, Helen, is that we have the means to do it. I mean, you get people and like Bill Gates, who I saw at the COP, who've known for years as well. And, you know, Bill's obviously he's one of the people that have created the modern world in many respects. And he puts his faith in new technologies, and that's his go. But there is a risk that if we say, oh, we need a new technology here, a new technology there, we're avoiding the reality that we don't have much time. And we do have the techniques and technologies to do the job now, and we've got to get cracking with them. So, you know, I think I would be reasonably optimistic. I think but it's hard, you know, as you know, you and I both know, people are difficult, politics are difficult. Getting, you know, persuading people in your domestic electorate to change their mind is hard. It's pretty hard to do that with nations as well.
Yeah. Yes, the whole just transition issue. And I guess for Australia, you know, you have this vast coal industry. And while it's not, you know, the labour intensive industry it once was, nonetheless, there's a transition which impacts on jobs and somehow there has to be a strategy around that. But I think everything you've said, Malcolm, is music to our ears. Obviously, New Zealand has a big backbone of hydropower, and I understand that the International Hydropower Association today is talking about a much more environmentally aware hydropower development than was the case when New Zealand dammed, so many wild rivers and changed them substantially. Also on green hydrogen, the very first report our foundation produced with our foundation director was on green hydrogen and the possibilities for New Zealand. If you've got a lot of hydropower, then you can do a lot of green hydrogen. So this is all very exciting. I think on the cautious optimism about the COP, this was the first year that they held a health day, a health and climate day, and the issues are just huge. The health risks from what's happening to our climate. So that was positive. It allowed an airing of issues which hadn't had sufficient airing before. But as you say, in the end, we have to stop burning fossil fuel, and industry is fighting that. That part of industry had a big presence there. On the other hand, the people committed to renewables had a significant presence as well. So hopefully that balanced out somewhere. But if we went from there to how is Australia going to cope with its energy mix in the foreseeable future? I know your government's still under pressure to permit new coal mines. Is there? I mean, you must, with your level of optimism and what you know, be optimistic about Australia being able to make the transition, even though it's coming from, if you like, a low base with the big coal dependence.
Right. Well, yeah, good. I agree. Let me unpack this a bit. You're right. We do have a big fossil fuel export sector, both coal and gas and natural gas. The viability of those industries depends, on there being demand for those products. And so, the reality is the success of the Australian coal export sector is not going to be decided in Canberra. It'll be decided in international markets. And as other countries decarbonise, the demand for our coal and gas will decline. There is a tendency for people to think that change is linear, in the sense that you might say, well, here we are in 2023, let's say by 2050, we accept there won't be any coal going out. And so we draw a nice smooth curve from now to 2050. In fact, change tends to be much, much more jagged. And, you can get, you might get periods where exports increase and then suddenly they fall off a cliff. The energy transition is happening, and it is going to mean the end of our coal and gas exports, and we should welcome that, because if they don't end, we won't have much of a planet or much of a climate we want to live in. Now, can you do it without fossils? The answer is they absolutely can. I mean, Australia is blessed with a big country. I mean, New Zealand's not as big, but it's still got plenty of real estate and plenty of different topology. So both our countries have got plenty of opportunity for solar and for wind. And what will happen in the clean energy world is that most of your primary generation will be from solar and wind. Hydro will increasingly be used as a firming source of energy. And so this is I'm just talking now about hydro generically. So if you take the hydro you have in New Zealand, where you've got a lot of it, and it's running, much of it's running 24/7 to provide the electricity you need. As you move to more wind and more solar, you can then just use that hydro more sparingly and use it when the sun's not blowing and the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. Now, in Australia, we are a big, flat, dry country. We don't have the hills you have. We don't have the, we don't like well, to give you an idea of how flat we are, the Murray River, which as you know is our longest. If you go from the dam at Albury, which is in the foot of the Great Dividing Range, all the way down to South Australia, the river runs for about 2,600 linear kilometres, and the drop in elevation is less than 200 metres in that whole distance. So it's just, there'd be billiard tables that could be steeper than that, right? So so what that means is that we don't have a lot of, what hydro we've got, pretty much we've exploited. The opportunity we have is with pumped hydro. And that's really interesting and exciting. And I don't think the debate in New Zealand, based on the discussions I had with the previous government, I don't think people have actually got their head around what an opportunity it is. And let me explain. When we think of hydro, we think of damming rivers, as you said, flooding valleys, environmental damage, and you're absolutely right. The IHA, has a whole sustainability standard, and we work. We have an independent organisation that gives essentially a sustainability rating to new projects. But with pumped hydro, you don't need a lot of water or a lot of land. And I'll just give you an example. There's one project I'm working on with my own renewables company in Australia at the moment, which will generate 700 megawatts for 10 hours. Now that's a hell of a battery. I think you'd agree. It involves an upper reservoir built 400 meters above the lower reservoir, which is 8 million cubic meters, so 8 billion liters. 8 million cubic meters is 40 hectares at an average depth of 20 meters. Now, 40 hectares is not obviously an urban, like the footprint of your house in the suburbs in a city, but it's not a huge amount of land. It's, it's a bit over 100 acres. And so that relatively small amount of water and relatively small amount of real estate can provide enormous storage. I got interested in all of this stuff in 2016. Got keenly interested. I'd always been interested in it, but got keenly interested in 2016 when I was PM, and we got a scientist at the ANU called Andrew Blakers to do effectively what was an atlas of Australia and then a global atlas of pumped hydro opportunities. And so these are areas where you've got access to water, differing to, obviously the right elevation differences, not in national parks or World Heritage areas, or, et cetera. And there are just tens and tens of thousands of locations. So you can actually, you can very readily say, we'll have lots and lots of solar, we'll have as much wind as, we can build and, the community will accept. And then we just work out how much pumped hydro we need for longer durations and batteries for short durations. And there you are, you've got it licked. And it's not rocket science, but you do have to get on and build it. As I've always said, Moore's law does not apply to digging holes. So, you have to actually have to do the work.
Malcolm, I know you were right across the Lake Onslow pumped hydro proposal that the previous New Zealand government had, which seemed to sort of move very slowly. So a lot of money's been sort of sunk into, I suppose, the development of the case, but I don't think a sod of earth was ever turned. But that's just been canned by the incoming government, which looks like a bit of a missed opportunity for us. When you did that sort of exploration of where the potential was for pumped hydro around the world, did that focus on New Zealand?
Well, it does. New Zealand is definitely included in it, and you could find it if people Google pumped hydro atlas ANU, Andrew Blakers, they'll find it very quickly. It's a global resource. I mean, I think the critical things that make, the critical things that make a pumped hydro project worthwhile are, one, you've obviously got to have the right geology and geotechnical stuff, and that can be challenging. You can, if you've got two existing dams that are reasonably close to each other at differing elevations, you can connect them. That's what's happening with Snowy Hydro 2.0. And those two dams are massive. So that's like a unique opportunity to create what will probably be the biggest battery in the world, to be honest. Be able to generate over 2,000 megawatts for 7.5 days without repumping. So that's gigantic. But a more conventional thing is you either create or you find a lower reservoir, which might just be, and then you put another one on top of a hill nearby. And the assuming the geotechnical stuff is right, the ideal thing is to have more elevation is better than less, and you want to have, and closer is better than further away. So we talk about a length to head ratio. So if your head is 500 meters, the length of the watercourse that connects it, the closer that is, the better. So if you had 500 meters elevation and 2 kilometers of watercourse, that would be 4-to-1. That'd be cracking site. But you don't want to be more than 10-to-1. And this is just I'm just giving kind of nuts and bolts economics of it. There are some really good there's some really good New Zealand engineers in the pumped hydro area, by the way. In fact, one of them I met who does a lot of work in the UK, a guy called Craig Scott, who works for a company called Stantec. And I met him in Glasgow, and he's been working on pumped hydro in Scotland and UK and Israel, right around the world. So, New Zealand is the home of a lot of great hydro engineers. Curiously enough, so is Tasmania. We had the World Hydropower Congress recently in Bali, and I asked all the Tasmanians in the hall to put their hands up, and it was, I was wondering whether there was anyone left in Hobart. There were so many hydro engineers.
Well, it sounds like pumped hydro gives Australia a chance to make much better use of the limited water resource that it has. That would be my conclusion. Yeah,
it absolutely does. It is very, very economic. See, if you've got massive rivers that are just flowing all the time, and you can do run of river hydro, you don't think about it. Like Canada, for example, has hardly any pumped hydro, because they've got those huge rivers coming out of the Great Lakes, and they harness them. Interestingly, pumped hydro was first built on a large scale to support nuclear power, because nuclear power plants, of course, run at the same rate. You can't ramp them up and down like a gas plant, for example. So they would have when they had excess electricity at night, they'd pump water up to a higher reservoir and then use that as a peaking plant during the day. Anyway, I will now stop talking about it. I'm quite capable of boring for the world on this topic. So
no, it's fascinating, but it perhaps raises then the broader issue of how our countries get dynamic climate action agendas. And in Australia, like New Zealand, it's tended to be a bit polarised. Out on one end, you've got the climate change skeptics. On the other, you might have Extinction Rebellion in the UK, for example. But I think most people buy into the fact that there is, human-induced climate change. But then the desire for for action and the speed at which it can happen, it becomes quite a controversial matter. How do you see Australia picking its way through this? Because your politics have been quite polarised on it from observing across the ditch, as it were.
Yeah, well, we've I mean, I think one of the big problems we've had is Murdoch. You're very lucky not to have Murdoch in the media in New Zealand. We look, basically what you've seen, and you see this in the US too, is on the right wing of politics, you've got a global warming was turned into an identity issue, an ideological issue, almost a religious issue, cultural war issue. And in Australia, you had that toxic combination of the fossil fuel sector that had a vested interest in it. You had the populist right in politics, which was the right wing of much of the right wing of my party, the Liberal Party. And of course you had the right wing media, and this is where Murdoch, was totally uninhibited. I mean, Murdoch's media, and you see it particularly with Fox News in the States or Sky News in Australia, and you get Sky in New Zealand, so you see what they're doing after dark. It's wild stuff. It is untethered to facts, reality, and essentially it's what I call angertainment, and it's created an ecosystem in which a lot of crazy populism has flourished. And so that's been the challenge in Australia. Now, I think so how's that worked out politically? Well, I think it worked out well for Abbott. It helped him win the election in 2013. It blew up on Morrison massively. A bunch of other reasons, but you will have noticed that in Australia, not only did the Liberal Party lose a lot of seats under Morrison at the elections last year to Labor, but more importantly, they lost a bunch of seats to independents. So there are now collectively 9 electorates. Now, bear in mind, we have 150 seats in our House of Representatives. There are 9 electorates that used to be absolutely roll goal safe Liberal seats. I mean, seats literally where all you'd spend on your campaign was whatever you needed to put up a few core flutes and how to votes and a few flyers, right? You just, very, very safe seats. 9 of those seats are now held by small L Liberal women, all women, all committed to climate action, and all generally, progressive on social issues. And these 6 of them were won at the last election, and 3 of them were won at previous elections. But the reality is, that it's. I mean, it's I think potentially a terminal problem for the Liberal Party, because if you can't hold your safest seats, how do you get to a majority? Because ultimately it's all arithmetic. So if when you're trying to, you've done this, we've both done this, you're trying to work out how do you get to your majority, and you start off with the safe seats, and then suddenly if independents say, right, I'm taking 9 of them off the bottom of the pile, it's a lot harder to get in our system, say, to 76. So I think I think a public opinion is more positive about needing action on global warming. I think it's hard to persuade Australians that renewable energy is a fake or too expensive, because over a third of households have got solar panels on their roofs, so people know, and they're not doing that. But they're doing that because they want to pay less on their electricity bill. And of course, as you know, we've had the most terrible extreme climate events. But having said that, you've got to manage it well. And my big concern is that we're not we're not doing enough in the long duration storage area. So, you know, I would be saying to your new Prime Minister, you know, regardless of your views on global warming, if you think you're going to move to having more solar and more wind, which is inevitable, then you're going to need more storage. And one of the best ways to do that, unless you want to spend a lot of money on buying batteries from China or America, best way to do that is to have pumped hydro. Now, whether Onslow's the best location, I don't know. You know, but you know, all you need is a hole on the bottom of a hill and a hole on the top of the hill. You know?
Simple.
Well, it's simple. It's simple until you have to actually do it. But yeah, right. It's not. You don't. What I'm saying is, you don't have to invent. You know, it's not like, you know, inventing AI or something, or Chat GPT. You know, it's like, it's essentially we know what you need to do.
Yeah. Malcolm, you referred to this, you know, this role of the media in encouraging, if you like, you know, this extreme populism on anything from climate change to other issues. But we saw that that kind of populism, conservative populism, in a way, on the voice referendum, did we not? I think everyone in New Zealand's interested in where the debate on Indigenous issues goes in Australia now. And we ask this question with some humility, because policy on Indigenous issues is, to put it mildly, in some flux in New Zealand at the moment. But we'd be interested in your reflections on, you know, where from now, with the voice referendum having failed.
Okay, right. Well, look, a little bit of history. There has been a movement to have Indigenous Australians, first Australians, recognised in our Constitution for a very long time. And in fact, in the Republic referendum in 1999, there was in addition to the amendment relating to the Republic, there was an amendment proposing a change to the preamble to the Constitution to acknowledge Indigenous Australians, and the full history of our continent. Anyhow, that was defeated. They both went down, but the preamble changed by a much larger majority, interestingly. Anyway, there was a long movement from about 2000, well, actually started by John Howard. Well, that's not started by John Howard, but John was the first Prime Minister to express interest in it. It was bipartisan to have recognition of Indigenous Australians in the Constitution. And it had always been felt that this would be essentially, largely symbolic. You know, it would be recognition. It wasn't going to be conferring new or different rights on anybody. And then in about 2016, there was a process going on that had been set up. There was a advisory council. And then at about 2016, the Indigenous leadership, and in particular, a gentleman called Noel Pearson and a colleague of his, Megan Davis, a law professor, started strongly advocating and getting support for the proposition that there should be an amendment to the Constitution to provide that there will be a voice, which that is to say an advisory assembly to the Parliament and to the government, composed of and elected and chosen solely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that required a lot of support from the Indigenous mob. Now, I was PM at the time, and my view was, and my cabinet's view was, firstly, we didn't think it was a good idea in principle, because we thought it was fine to have a voice, by the way. No one had any problems with that. And in fact, we were moving in that direction anyway. But putting it in the Constitution didn't appeal to me in particular, because I'm a Republican. I believe that the only qualification for any office in our country should be Australian citizenship, right? And that doesn't matter whether you're a black fella whose, ancestors have been here for 60,000 years, or whether you're like me, whose family been here since European settlement, or you just got your citizenship last week. You're a migrant from, India or China or anywhere. So that's a very Republican view. Now, that was my view, but in addition to that, and really more significantly, we and I in particular was very strongly of the view this was doomed to failure, could not win, given the dynamics of a constitution. Anyway, what happened was time went on, there was polling that was generally indicated a degree of support, but it was polling into a vacuum, and you know how dangerous that is, when you go asking people opinions about issues that haven't properly been debated, pointless. Anyway, the Labor Party basically got persuaded that they should support it and put it up to referendum, obviously appealed to the Labor left in particular, and the referendum was held. Now, once Albo committed himself to doing that, Lucy and I supported the referendum because, while I didn't, I had my reservations about it, I thought it was going to be a lot worse if it went down than if it got up. But regrettably, so I tried to prove myself wrong, but it lost by 61 to 39, which, as you know, is a trouncing. And yes, there were lies told and misrepresentations and distortions, but I think the Murdoch media was particularly antagonistic, but all of that was pretty much to be expected. I mean, there were plenty of lies. I mean, if you looked at the no case, the official no case in the voice referendum, it looked like half of it was the same as the no case in the Republic referendum, because it's always the same thing. If you don't know, vote no, risk of change, all sorts of slippery slope arguments. And so it's a tragedy, Helen. It's an absolute tragedy because it will set back reconciliation. And it was hopefully not too much, but I think it was, I honestly think it was, I understand why Labor felt they had to put it up, but I think I look back at those meetings in 16 and 17, and I had these, the people that I was making these points, and I know they were thinking, oh, poor old Malcolm, he's got PTSD from the Republic referendum. But, one of the leaders on the referendum council was a tax lawyer from Melbourne, a guy called Mark Liebler. And I thought to myself, here he is being patronising to me and suggesting I don't know anything about referendums and electoral politics. Well, I wouldn't presume to tell him about tax avoidance schemes, but he seems to think he knows everything about everything. And it was a train wreck. So the long way of saying it's very sad, but I think we just have to recognize the mistake it wasn't so much a mistake having a voice, proposing a voice. The mistake was putting it up in a referendum. And of course, now the problem Albanese's got is there'd be a lot of people that'd say, oh, well, that went down. Let's just legislate it. Let's just legislate a voice and, work out the right model. But the problem is, as well as I do, I mean, from Albo's point of view, he's got to say to himself, well, if I were to do that, people are going to say, hang on, mate, we just had a vote on this. And over 60% said no. So you can back off. And why don't you start focusing on cost of living, interest rates, healthcare, all of the bread and butter issues. And so, and of course, it's done enormous damage to the Labor government. I mean, they ripped up a lot of political capital over it. So
yes, well, it's a sobering story for sure, and
all actually, in all, a lose-lose, I would say.
Yeah. Interestingly, Chile has been through a referendum process. You might recall there were huge protests there in late 2019 from recollection, and that led to the election of a Constituent Assembly to draft a new constitution completely. And that consultative assembly was in effect dominated then, from the left and other progressive voices, and they produced a constitution that failed at the referendum it was put to. So then the president, by then former student activist, a young man, he said, well, we'll try and do it again. So they elect a new consultative assembly, which this time was the polar opposite of the one they had before, and they've now produced a constitution which is arguably worse than what they had before, which is going to a plebiscite in a couple of weekends' time. So I must say I loathe referenda. I think it's very hard to carry referenda, and that they can cause a government a lot of grief.
Well, you see, one of the best things about our electoral system in Australia is compulsory voting. The combination of compulsory voting, preferential voting, and an independent electoral commission that draws the boundaries means that in Australia, unlike in the US, politics is very much, the debate is around the centre, and you get, you don't have to go off to the crazy right or left to get your base out to vote, because if they don't vote, they get fined $100. And most, a vast majority of people vote. I mean, when we had the voluntary postal ballot on gay marriage at the end of 2017, that was completely voluntary. 80% voted. It's pretty amazing. So, but compulsory voting works against you with the referendums, because the people that, the no case will always say, if you don't know, vote no. They will always muddy the waters and complexify it. And there will always be people who, for whatever reason, busy with their families, jobs, more interested in the football or whatever, will not have paid attention. Then you say to them, righto, get off the couch, mate, down to the polling station, and you've got to vote. And they go, oh, God, I don't understand this. Oh, easier just to vote no.
Yeah.
So compulsory voting makes the hurdle for winning referendums even harder, and that's why hardly any have been carried in Australia.
Yeah. We haven't carried them here since the MMP vote, which was a vote of revulsion against political parties having untrammeled power and governments.
Now, Helen, can I just make an observation? As you know, I've been an admirer of visitor to New Zealand for pretty much all my life. In fact, my mother lived in New Zealand in the 60s, and I used to go and visit her there. So I go back a long way. I've never met a New Zealander who admits to having voted for MMP. But there must have been a majority.
It was a narrow majority. The majority on the indicative referendum, when people were asked what change they wanted, that was huge. But when it came down to MMP versus the status quo, it kind of crept over the line, not by a large margin. And, every time there's a coalition that, let's say generates a few issues in debate, and the one we have now might well be one of them, the issue will come up again. Did we really need this? But, in the end, there was another referendum held on whether it needed to be changed, and people said, don't touch it. So I guess we have the system we have for better or worse, richer or poorer, as it were.
Yeah, for sure.
Malcolm, I can see we've got a few questions up here, and one we didn't get to, which I was going to ask you, which David Shand, well known in Australia as a former Auditor General at some point, I think. David asks, how can we Liberal Democrats, alarmed by the electoral rise of right-wing populism, what can we do to combat it, apart from wringing our hands? Is it a leadership, communication, or a policy gap, David asks?
Well, I think it's all of those, but I think it's also a delivery issue. And in my own podcast, which Murray kindly referred to earlier, Defending Democracy, one of those, and they're all available. People can find them on their podcast app. In one of them, I chatted with Theresa May, former UK Prime Minister and long time, actually university friend of mine. But Theresa made, in response to pretty much that question, she made the point that democracies have got to do a better job at delivering. And if you have a parliamentary democracy of the kind we, are used to and like, and, there is, dreadful economic inequality, people can't afford to buy a house, the healthcare system only works for the rich, the education system doesn't work for the, working people. If it's not working, then you open the way for a mountebank like a Trump to come in and say, only I can fix it, the strong man, so-called, and people who feel democracy, we've got to make sure democracy works and delivers. And so I think, one thing that, and this applies to both the left and the right, if you allow your agenda to be driven by media, particularly that entertainment media that makes its money out of riling people up, and you spend your time focusing on culture war issues, you overlook the basics, you leave yourself open to a wannabe strongman. So I think the answer to David's question is agree with everything the points he raised, except apart from wringing your hands. That's wring your hands if you like, but that's not going to do any good. But, advocacy, leadership, persuasion, but you've also got to deliver the goods.
Yeah, accepted. Rosalind Noonan, the former Chief Human Rights Commissioner in New Zealand, asks Malcolm whether you'd care to comment on the conflicts in Myanmar and Afghanistan and the two raging wars involving external actors too, Ukraine and Palestine, Israel. Any reflections from them as an Australian leader?
I mean, they're all very different. They're all very different, and they're all terrible, tragic, and the global community's got to do everything it can to bring them to an end. I mean, in a sense, the biggest of them in terms of troops, and resources is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in a sense, that is the one that is most readily resolved. I mean, that was a completely unforced invasion of a sovereign country by another, in the Palestine, Israel, Gaza dimension, I mean, there's that overworked term, the cycle of violence, but you don't have to get into an argument about excusing or justifying one side. Obviously Israel, in terms of the terrible attack that Hamas made on Israel, the Israeli state had to respond. Every country's obligation is to defend its own citizens. And if you attack a country, particularly in the way that Hamas did, they were inciting and inviting the invasion of Gaza that followed. I mean, you may have seen there was a statement by all the former Australian PMs except for Paul Keating, which made that point, that this was, what has happened in Gaza, what is the terrible costs that have been imposed on the Gazan population was Hamas's intention, in the same, I mean, it was the inevitable consequence of what they did. This is what they were seeking to provoke. But the fundamental problem there is there has to be, the only solution that can work is a two-state solution, because otherwise you're just going to have this thing happening again and again. And this is the point Lloyd Austin has made, you know, that the Israeli Defence Force has got to recognise that in their efforts to pursue a tactical victory, they could be laying the groundwork for a strategic defeat. And, you know, and unfortunately, the politics in both well, certainly with Hamas and in, you know, much of the Palestinian, you know, point of view, and you can understand why that's the case, and ditto extreme views on among the Israeli side that are not reconciled to that. But what is the alternative? I mean, you can't just have you can't, I mean, a model that says where each side's you know, model is one of constant war until one side is annihilated. Well, that's, you know, that's a catastrophe. You talked about Afghanistan. Well, I mean that again. Perhaps just leave that for a moment. But terrible, tragic outcome there that it is. But I think in Myanmar, the politics there are, and the animosities, you know, the ethnic rivalries and animosities are so intense. It's tragic. I remember, you know, anyway, I've had many discussions with, you know, leaders from Myanmar, and including the former Prime Minister, and you know, it is. There are there are issues there that I think, from our perspective in New Zealand and Australia, I just don't know. I don't know whether we've got enough insight to really understand them, but it's hard to see what a solution is, other than saying to people, you've got to, you know, learn to live with each other. And I mean, one of the things I often reflect on, Helen, which I'd really interested what your thoughts would be on this, is, you know, we live in an era where human technology is more advanced than it's ever been, you know, and you could say human knowledge is more advanced, tech is more advanced, medicine, everything's more advanced. But it does seem to me that we are less tolerant of each other and less respectful of each other and less able to live with people of different races and backgrounds than we were in the past. I mean, if you look at the Middle East, there are so many parts of the Middle East and, you know, great communities that used to be polyglot, used to be multi-ethnic, multi-religious. I mean, if you look at the, you know, great, even cities like Istanbul or Constantinople, you know, Beirut, Alexandria, all through that part of the world, it was much more diverse than it is today, and the animosities seem to be so much greater. And you can make that point in a lot of other parts of the world. So why is it that we, you know, communities that used to live, you know, sometimes uneasily, but more often than not peacefully, side by side, are no longer able to do so?
Well, think, for example, of Sarajevo, which was, you know, really the intersection of three faiths, the Orthodox, Muslim, and Catholics, and how that blew up spectacularly. And again, you know, often it is, well, it's populism applied to identity politics, and you know, looking for what divides people rather than what unites them, which is a sad reflection. Malcolm, we're getting very close to the end. Obviously, I've got a lovely message here on the trail from Sikai Holland of Zimbabwe, whose husband Jim is an Australian, and Sikai spent time in Australia. She was at one point a senator in Zimbabwe associated with Morgan Tsvangirai's party, the Movement for Democratic Change. And Sikai says, no question here, just a big thank you, Helen, for bringing Malcolm onto this webinar at the end of 2023. It's most encouraging listening in from Harare at our 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. Malcolm, thank you very much for all the wonderful work you and Lucy undertake and have done over the decades. Thank you from Sikai.
Thank you, Sekai. That's real. I'm really touched.
Really lovely words.
Yeah.
Malcolm, I mean, we could chat all day, and and it's really been marvelous getting your perspectives, and also the the in-depth background to the referendum, and then particularly I think you've given us a lot to think about on the pumped hydro, and personally I hope New Zealand doesn't forego the opportunities to make better use of the water resource we have. Yeah. Truth is, with the climate crisis, we're all going to be more water challenged. Our cities are growing. Our basic agricultural and horticultural industries require a lot of water. It may rain a lot here, but it's less predictable. It's not always where you want it. We are starting to face some significant water challenges. Yeah. And something that uses our water more effectively than we have for our electricity, I think intrinsically it has to be explored. So I think you've given us new room for thinking about that as well.
Can I add one little footnote to this? I said earlier that in the renewable energy world, most of our primary generation will be solar and wind, but it's becoming very obvious that in a lot of communities it's harder to get wind built because people object to it. Whereas solar is really easy to roll out, whether at a small scale, because you can't really have a wind on a small scale effectively, but you can have, we have several gigawatts of solar going onto people's roofs every year in Australia. So you can roll it out in a small scale, you can roll it out in a large scale, no moving parts, it's cheap and getting more efficient. So if you have a grid that has got a lot more solar in it than you had thought, you're going to need more storage. Because, the wind does blow at night, but the one thing about solar is, it's only going to work when the sun's up. Yeah. And that's pretty predictable. So that's right. So that the storage side of things, and I mean, the question I'd be asking politicians, this is a question to ask politicians in New Zealand and everywhere, is to say, okay, mate, I've heard all your arguments about this being too hard and that being too hard, but what are you going to do to firm the renewables? And unless they've got an answer to that, you've got a real problem. And you get people who'll say, "Oh, we should have nuclear power." Well, whether you think nuclear power is good or bad or affordable or unaffordable, it doesn't firm renewables, because you firm renewables with something that's flexible. So a gas peaker can do it. And so the politician could say, well, just use gas peakers. And you say, hang on, isn't the whole object of this exercise to stop burning gas and coal?
Malcolm, we've got lovely messages coming in on the chat. Faith Austin of Queenstown. I have enormous respect for Malcolm while not being a Liberal Party supporter. Thank you, Helen, for this wonderful conversation. And Jill White says, it's been a delight to be in the presence of such important thinking and thinkers. Big thanks. So I think our webinar has really responded extremely positively to us having this conversation. And let's try and repeat it someday, because there'll never be any shortage of things to talk about. Thank you so much, Malcolm.
Thanks so much, Helen. Yep. Cheerio. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you all. That's the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you very much to our guest, Malcolm Turnbull, for your insights. Thank you, Helen, and thank you to our viewers for joining today's discussion. If you have a moment, please complete a quick evaluation of this webinar, which you should be prompted to do shortly after you sign out. That was our final webinar for 2023. We look forward to seeing you for an exciting lineup of webinars in 2024. Noho ora mai, mate wai.